You're watching No More News.
I'm Adam Green with No More News. Today I'm joined by author and 9/11 researcher Christopher Bollyn, ChristopherBollyn.com. He's got the books, his new book, The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East, and his previous book from, what year did Solving 9/11 come out?
2012.
2012, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. Two books that are the best books on 9/11 in my opinion. They point out the who, why, and how. So Chris, thanks for coming and talking with me today.
You're welcome.
So tell me about the tour. How many stops have you made so far, and how many more do you have?
Well, the tour just started in first week of September. I've been about half a dozen places, and I've got about a dozen or so more.
And this isn't your first tour. You did 2 tours for Solving 9/11?
No, this is the 6th tour. First tour was in the fall of 2014, and there's been 5 since then.
5. And these are mostly in the U.S., or you've gone around the world also?
Well, these are the U.S. tours I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. I've also done some tours in Europe.
Yeah. And how are you received in America compared to other countries?
Well, I'm received everywhere pretty well, with the exception of places where there's a kind of an orchestrated protest, like in Brooklyn or Tucson. Mm-hmm. But generally, if somebody invites me to a place like a public library, then usually the event goes ahead with no problem. Public libraries are, in fact, a bastion of free speech in this country.
On your book tour, you give your presentations, and they're available online. There's several of them on YouTube. Mm-hmm. Really good, lots of information. What are the type of people that come out to protest the events? Talk to me about the protesters.
Well, there was a small protest in Tucson, and there was an organized group. But there was a bigger protest in Brooklyn, and that was done by a group, a Jewish group for racial and economic equality, something to that nature. And when you go to their website and look at who funds them, you see that Larry Silverstein and Clara Silverstein are 2 of the main funders and their organizations.
Oh, there's no conflict of interest there.
No.
So, how do the protesters behave when they're there? Like, they violent?
Well, in Brooklyn, they were quite out of line. They would come into the event. They would start shouting. They did everything they could to disrupt it, to intimidate people. It was really quite obnoxious. They were shouting, and they had some burly guy who was pushing people around, and they were just being really obnoxious. And so the Brooklyn police had to come out to escort me out from the premises safely.
Good. I'm glad that they were there to protect
Mm-hmm.
you.
They were very good.
So I read a few of the articles on the ADL and the SPLC. You're like one of their enemy number ones. Mm-hmm. And they had like an organized campaign to try to have people cancel your events, and they try to pressure the venues.
Yeah, I don't know who's behind that, but there is a fellow in Canada and some other people who take it upon themselves to contact venues and to threaten them, threaten the venues in order that they will pull the event, and that has happened. That's happened before in Massachusetts and New York.
How does that make you feel when they cancel your event and stop your free speech, even though it's so fact-based? Like, they can't even stop and have a dialogue and a discourse and listen to you.
Well, yeah, it's like what I tell the protesters. I tell the protesters, come inside, listen to the presentation, and you can ask your questions afterwards. We can talk about this. But they're not willing to do that. They're not wanting to have a discussion. And it's the same thing with these other detractors. They don't want to discuss the evidence. They don't want to discuss 9/11 facts. They simply want to attack me, calling me an anti-Semite or a Nazi or something like that. That's the end of the discussion.
There's a picture of you online on one of these sites, and it says, I think the headline was like, "Oh, you didn't know that Nazis speaking at your event," and they have a picture of you like behind some like German lettering. Have you seen that picture?
Oh, they have a picture of me, and I think you're talking about the picture from in Germany. I was at the train station in Wannsee, and it has the old Gothic text, is Wannsee Station.
Yeah.
I lived in Wannsee. What's the big deal?
Yeah. It's not like you're wearing a swastika or anything.
Right, thank you.
Anybody that's been to Germany is apparently a Nazi. Oh. So how about the people that are in support that come out to the event? Are there people that like are on the fence, or is everybody mostly supporters?
Well, that's hard to say. It depends where I'm speaking. I've spoken in places like Spokane, Washington, where when I asked the people, about their feelings on Israel, about half the audience was Christian Zionist. So it depends where I'm speaking. But most people are interested, obviously, and I would say most of them are actually supportive of my position. They're familiar with it because it's a group of people who are quite awake, and they're very much aware of 9/11 research that come to my presentations generally. Mm-hmm. It's not people that don't know anything about it. It's the average person who doesn't know anything about 9/11 is not interested in 9/11 for a reason. They're in denial. They don't want to talk about it. It scares them. So the people who come to my event, I often say, are some of the most extraordinary people in America, because they have moral courage and they have the intelligence to understand that they've been lied to.
Speaking of moral courage, that's a good segue to go to one of the quotes in your book, which is from Netanyahu in his book. What is his book called?
Fighting Terrorism, I think.
Fighting Terrorism. And the quote is on page 50. But in many cases, of course, it is perfectly possible to determine who the terrorists are and who stands behind them. If governments have failed to do this, it is more often not for lack of knowledge, but for lack of courage and moral clarity. So, and that's Netanyahu, How the West Can Win, 1986.
Terrorism, How the West Can Win.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So he's presumably talking about like Western governments and then the terrorists being Al-Qaeda in this quote, right?
Yeah, well, he said this this is from 1986, and so he's talking about, he's probably referring generally to Palestinian and what he called Arab terrorism or Islamic terrorism. Yeah.
But do you think that like the underlying read between the lines here is he's really talking about that they're the ones that are behind the terrorism?
Well, he's not saying that, but the quotes of Netanyahu are good for this purpose because they're applicable to any terrorist operation, any terrorist thing. And so, whether it's a false flag terror operation that's been done by the Israelis perhaps, or something that's a genuine act of terrorism, it goes both ways. It's true. And so it's like Netanyahu has had this, the Netanyahu Institute's been working on terrorism since like 1979. So there's a lot of Israeli analysis and study of terrorism that goes into his comments. It's the same thing like he said about the media. He said that the terrorists need to control the mass media. Well, that works just as well for the Israelis, that they need to control the mass media to get their way.
Yeah. Read us that quote, too. Talk about that.
Yeah, but this is Netanyahu from the same book, Terrorism, How the West Can Win. He says, but how do we form our opinions of the present? The West depends in large measure on its media. This is why terrorists, in their war against the West, devote so much of their strategy and their effort to capturing the Western press and using it for their own purposes. Yeah, well, if you look at the Western press and who owns it, it's primarily owned by companies or individuals who are strongly Zionist. Like in the case of CBS News, the president and CEO of CBS News is a man named Leslie Moonves, who is the grandnephew of the founding Prime Minister of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. So it's like it's not a
Rupert Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch is and
Sumner Redstone.
Yeah, there's many. Yeah. It's been the case all along, and in the case of people like Mr. Murdoch, he was created to be the media mogul he is with deep pocket funding from the Rothschilds. You don't become the owner of 160 newspapers across the United States and Britain, with chump change.
Isn't he involved with investments in the drilling with the Kushners in the Golan Heights too? Have you heard of that?
Yes, Murdoch is a partner with the Rothschilds in the drilling on the Golan Heights, which is illegal, and the Rothschilds are also primary owners of the oil of Kurdistan in the north of Iraq, which will be voting for independence within a fortnight.
Okay. All right, back to the tour. What would you say? You traveled all around the U.S. and all over the world. What is the state of the 9/11 truth movement, and how has it evolved over the years?
Well, how has it evolved? It's gotten more, at this point, 16 years later, it's gotten more real. I mean, that people now understand more about 9/11, who did it and why they did it, because we're 16 years into the war on terror. And my current tour is primarily focused on the war on terror, because this is the ongoing crime. 9/11 was the atrocity that happened 16 years ago. 3,000 people were killed in broad daylight. But ever since then, more and more people have been killed every day because of the war on terror. And the war on terror and 9/11 are like two sides of a counterfeit coin. It's a fraud. And once people understand the 9/11 fraud, they will understand the fraud of the war on terror. But in actual reality, the war on terror is older, much older.
Yeah, and your book gets into that, the origins, 1979, the Jerusalem Conference.
Right.
What do you think the 9/11 movement needs to like really get over the hump and like reach a critical mass?
Well, that's a good question, because the mainstream media is not ever going to address 9/11 truth, because they're complicit in the crime. So what needs to happen is that we're having a revolution of awareness in this country. People are waking up and realizing that they've been lied to by the media and the government for the last 16 years and longer. And in the case, it's still a situation that the John F. Kennedy murder is still covered up by the mainstream media and the government. So this is what we hope to achieve is that we hope that people of well-known reputations and means, deal with 9/11 truth, come to terms with it, and embrace it. And when more and more people understand the deception of 9/11, we hope that we can end the war on terror. And what we really want to do is, we want a proper investigation of 9/11, because it's never been investigated at all as a crime. The evidence was destroyed. We want to bring the guilty to account, the people who were involved in the crime and the deception and the covering up of the crime. And we want to end the war. We want to end the war on terror, and again, prosecute those people who have been part of the war crimes that have been committed, because the war on terror is primarily a war of conquest and aggression that's being waged under the pretext of fighting terrorism. But it's not. It's a crime. And so the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, these are wars of aggression. And that's what the British inquiry, the Chilcot inquiry, made very clear. But we haven't had anything like the Chilcot inquiry in this country. But we need to do that. We need to clean house, because we can't go forward into a future of peace and prosperity based on the lies that we've accepted for the last 16 years as true.
Do you think we need to mobilize around a political candidate that talks about 9/11 truth? Like, somebody need to break into politics, like maybe Tulsi Gabbard? She talks about ISIS and funding ISIS. Have you spoken to her?
Well, I haven't spoken to her, but I know she had the bill to stop funding terrorists, ISIS and what have you, in Syria. But I think that for us to put all our chips into a political candidate would be a mistake, because the political landscape is so tilted against us. We don't have any congressperson calling for 9/11 truth yet, after 16 years. Some people are calling, like Barbara Lee and Tulsi Gabbard, are calling for an end to the certain aspects of the war on terror, or renegotiating the authority to use military force, which is the funding and the authorization for the war on terror. But we need a popular resistance to this. We need, it's like I grew up during the Vietnam time, and there was a popular resistance to the war in Vietnam. We don't see anything like that in this country today. 16 years. You have to remember that the war on terror is the longest war in U.S. history at this point, the oldest war in U.S. history, and also the most expensive war in U.S. history. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. Originally started out to go after the terrorists who committed 9/11, many of whom supposedly died on 9/11. So going after a ragtag group of students and Taliban in Afghanistan, that shouldn't take more than a couple of weeks. But from the very beginning, they said this is going to take decades. Mm-hmm. Well, why? Because they knew that the real underlying strategy for the war on terror was to redraw the map of the Middle East, to conquer territories, and to cut the Arab countries into pieces. And that would take some time.
So yeah, you talk about sectarian enclaves. They want to have a Kurdistan. How does that benefit Israel to break up their surrounding Muslim countries into smaller sectarian groups? Is it just because they're fighting with one another, and that Israel, if they're smaller countries, that Israel is more powerful?
Well, yeah. First of all, if they can break up the Yinon Plan, the Oded Yinon Plan of 1982 made very clear that on the Eastern Front, Israel's primary targets were Iraq and Syria, in that order. And the first thing they wanted to do was to destroy the military of Iraq and Syria, and then to fragment the country along its ethnic lines or religious lines. It's called balkanization because it's exactly what was done to Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a large country, a socialist country. They broke it up into 6 or 7 statelets. And for Israel, that would mean that the other countries in the neighborhood would be similar ethnic states, and Israel is just another ethnic state. So they would have some moral justification in a neighborhood where everybody is similar, ethnic states. And then also they obviously weakened the big Ba'ath states, the big Arab states like Iraq and Syria. Well, Syria and Saudi Arabia is on the chopping block too. So it's like nobody. It's happened to Libya. It's happened to Lebanon and Yemen and Sudan. It's the game plan.
Do you think that Saudi Arabia is going to give up some of their land to Israel? Because if you look at the Greater Israel Project, the Arabs' Promised Land, that goes into Saudi Arabia. Are they going to? Because it seems like they're working together with ISIS, and they're not exposing them for 9/11. They work together on 9/11 and arming the Mujahideen. Mm-hmm. So is there a deal worked out where they're going to give them the Promised Land at one point, you believe?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how it's going to shake out. But I have seen that the maps of this balkanization of the Middle East do affect Saudi Arabia. They're trying to achieve this plan, and in Syria right now they're breaking the country up into 3 pieces or 4 pieces, and Iraq has already been broken up into 3 pieces. As I said, on the 25th of September there'll be a referendum in Kurdistan to become independent of Iraq. That's what they want to do, but there are obstacles along the way. In the case of Syria, there's been some obstacles in the form of Iran and the Russian military.
In the foreword to your book, Alan Sobrowski writes that you're optimistic that Trump might disclose 9/11 truth. I'm not sure when he wrote that, if he had already bombed Syria and revamped the war in Afghanistan, but do you still have that sentiment about Trump?
Well, I mean, I hope that Trump will do something about 9/11 truth and ending the war. He spoke about these things when he didn't speak about 9/11 truth specifically, but he did talk about having better relations with Russia, ending the conflict in Syria, and he has done some good things. He's pulled out from the CIA funding of the Syrian rebels. The war in Syria is now coming to a conclusion, largely because the United States has pulled back its support. So that's a good thing. The sooner the war in Syria is over, the sooner we get some balance, the better. I would have preferred that Donald Trump from the very beginning took a more muscular policy on ending the wars in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. But he didn't do that.
What do you think about his relationship with Silverstein and Netanyahu and the Kushners? Mm-hmm. You really think that's possible, that there's any chance that he will do that?
Well, he has had very close relations with Israelis and American Zionists for a long time. But that doesn't mean that he's in cahoots with the 9/11 cover-up. I would hope that as a New Yorker and as an American, he would not cover up the truth of 9/11, which is the fundamental thing that I'm talking about here. You can as a political leader, and when he ran for office, he told his policy guy that he wants to be the most pro-Israeli candidate out there. He was saying that because he wanted to win the election. But I would hope that even though he has these relations with these Zionists, that he is not party to the 9/11 crime or the cover-up.
I think he's a part of the cover-up because on 9/11 he said the buildings were so strong and he thought there was more than planes and bombs. And then a few days later he changed his tune completely and said that, oh, it's kamikazes and they're terrorists and there's nothing that would have stopped the buildings from coming down.
Right, that's right. He said on 11th of September, he said that there had been most likely bombs that went off simultaneously with the plane impacts, which is pretty true, pretty correct. I mean, a good observation. And as you said, 2 days later, he changed his tune. So whether somebody called him up and told him to change his tune is most likely the case. But that's happened all across the U.S., you know. I saw a professor from New Mexico Tech. He did the same thing. On day one, he spoke truth about 9/11. 10 days later, he changed his tune. And, you know, this is political. I think it's the politic thing to do for these people. They want to either keep their position, they want to keep their funding, they want to stay on the right side of the tracks, and so they go along with the cover-up.
Can you talk about your frustration, or do you ever think about giving up the fight for 9/11?
Well, that's a good question because, no, I haven't. I've never thought about giving up. And, you know, I can tell you that it's been very difficult. It's been very difficult at times. But, you know, it would be worse to give up, especially, you know, knowing what I know and having done the research that I've done over a period of years. It would be just stupid to give up. But more than that, it's like to give up and to give to let the lie go on for even one more day. It would be a sin. It's wrong. Yeah. You know, and this whole thing is so wrong. The way these people have hijacked our reality. The first chapter of this book, The War on Terror, it's like living with here it is, coping with artificial reality. Because in the 16 years since 9/11, that's where this country's been. The United States has been in this artificial reality. You know, we've been given a lie about what happened on 9/11, and based on that lie, we've gone to war. We're waged war against, you know, half a dozen Islamic nations. We've done terrible devastation to places like Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've done great damage to this country. You know, the cost of the war on terror is at least $2.5 trillion right now. That's not counting future costs down the road, which will double that. I mean, this is suicidal. And, you know, I love this country, and I want to see this country restore some of its integrity and get back on track. It's like the country's been hijacked. There's no better way to say it. The country's been hijacked. And you know, when the country's been hijacked, you can't just sit back in your first-class seat drinking champagne and not worry where the plane's going. You got to turn it around. And that's what I think, that's my obligation, and that's the obligation of people in the country who understand 9/11 truth.
Do you ever debate people on 9/11, like academics or people in media? Like, does anybody step up and actually want to debate with you?
No, not like that. You know, but occasionally I will take on somebody who's critical. You know, people who are quite critical of. For example, I don't usually get into debate with other people, or journalists, pundits, scholars, what have you, unless they attack 9/11 truth. I mean, one example was, I think, a man named Greg Palast. He turned against Stephen Jones, and in an interview on TV, he said, "Come at me, Jones. Come at me. You're a fraud." And I thought, gee, this is outrageous. Why is he attacking Professor Jones? Professor Jones did great research on finding the nanothermite and the destruction of the towers. And with a little investigation, I found that Mr. Palast has connections to Israeli intelligence. One of his uncles or great uncles or something like that was no less than David Kimke, the man who was the Israeli Mossad architect of Iran-Contra. So, I mean, you see, that's kind of like where my debate goes. When people attack 9/11 truth, when they attack me as an individual, when they attack Professor Jones or other 9/11 truth people, quite unjustly, then I will debate them or look into what they're saying because I want to find out why they're doing it. Because there's no logical or moral justification for attacking 9/11 Truth. Anybody who attacks 9/11 Truth or 9/11 Truthers is basically working for the other side.
What would you say the demographics of 9/11 movement are? You've been around the country. What is the 9/11, like how could you summarize and describe the 9/11 movement?
Well, I can't speak for the whole movement, but the people that come to my events generally tend to be older people and people who understand the betrayal that 9/11 represents to America.
Why do you think it's older people that come to your events?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. Older people know, they know very well, they know what we've lost. They're, and 9/11 happened when they were mature, when they were able to grasp it. And they know what we have, what's being lost in this country. Whereas young people who were just a couple years old when 9/11 happened, the war on terror has been like the wallpaper in the room for them. It is accepted, and they don't realize what this country has lost and what this country is losing. Mm-hmm. So it tends to be older people.
Now we're going to get into your famous CNN appearance. Mm-hmm. And do you know what year this was?
This was done in 2006.
And you had to know you're being interviewed by CNN. This is going to be a total hit piece. They play you for like 10 seconds.
Yeah, it was done. It was done before the trial. It aired on TV the night before my trial was supposed to begin.
Wow, so it was totally
it was a hit piece. Yeah, it was a hit piece.
Okay, So we're gonna start it, and we'll let me know whenever you want to interject, and I'll pause it.
We've all heard some absolutely incredible 9/11 conspiracy theories. The web, of course, is full of them. But tonight, we're bringing one out that feeds on racism out in the open.
So the introduction. What do you feel about that? Just they're introducing it as this is racism right away. Not like this is what some people think. It's just racist. Let us introduce you to the racist.
Right. Well, at the time, this lady, Paula Zahn, she was married to a man named Cohen, and that marriage ended a few years later. But she was, she was put up to this. She was told that you're going to make this piece, and we're going to do a piece about 9/11 and racism.
And when you talked to her and you interviewed, how long did she actually talk to you for?
I didn't talk to Paula Zahn. She's the hostess of the show. I spoke to Deborah Fayrick, who was the person that came out to Chicago.
Okay. And how long did they talk to you?
Well, they talked for several hours. They came to the public library. We met them there. They filmed the whole thing. And we took the precaution of recording the entire audio for ourselves because as you see, they tried to make a hit piece out of it.
We're absolutely shocked by one recent poll that found out that 1 in every 3 Americans believe the terror attacks were not the work of America's enemies, but some sort of inside job. And Deborah Fayrick found a smaller percentage who believe an even uglier theory.
1 in 3? I've seen stats that low, but also like 50%. So it's like, I feel like so many people question it. I go out and do interviews. People everywhere question 9/11. But I feel like the conspiracy stigma makes everybody not want to speak out about it and not talk about it.
Well, the year this video was made, 2006, was the last poll that the CBS New York Times did on 9/11 truth. And they asked the public, they did a poll, and they found that only 18% of the American people believed the government was being honest about 9/11. 84% of the public thought that the government was either hiding something or outright lying about 9/11. 84%.
Yeah.
So that's the year that video was made.
And the majority of the Muslim world, and you've gone and spoke to Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, the majority of the Muslim world, what do they think?
Well, I don't know. The Muslim world's a very big place.
From your experience.
Yeah. The Nation of Islam is special because they have a very intelligent leader and a brave man in Minister Farrakhan who is not afraid to address 9/11 truth. He's the only religious leader that I know of that has national stature that takes on 9/11 truth.
This is something that took tremendous sophistication to do, and that sophistication was not with Osama bin Laden or his followers. But if it was not Muslims, then who? Thanks to the exemplary work of scholars like Victor Thorne and Christopher Bollyn, it is now becoming apparent that there were many Israelis and Zionist Jews in key roles in the 9/11 attacks. Now look, if they can prove me wrong, like I said, I'll pay with my life, since they want to kill me anyway. Prove me wrong.
And in the Muslim world, outside the United States, I really don't know what their opinion is, but I do know that in the very beginning, in a global poll that was done, 7% of the people believed that the Israelis were behind 9/11.
7%?
Yes.
Cass Sunstein writes in his paper that the majority of countries, Muslim countries, believe it, and that's why it's so dangerous.
They believe
that 9/11 is a conspiracy.
Oh yeah,
and most of them believe it was the Jews.
Right.
This 9/11 attack was not by 19 Arabs. It was not by Muslims.
They talk about a Jewish plot.
Everywhere you look, you find a Zionist agent.
A conspiracy by Israeli intelligence.
في اللحظات نفسها.
Or by Zionist moles in the Bush administration, allegedly calling the shots in the Middle East. Websites, magazines, documentaries, radio programs, dozens of them disputing the facts that Al-Qaeda was behind the 9/11 attacks.
It was done by a group of Zionists.
Are you suggesting that Al-Qaeda had nothing to do with it, that this was all part of a large conspiracy, Zionist or otherwise?
Al-Qaeda is, in my opinion, has been exploited. I question whether such a group even exists.
Chicago writer Christopher Bollyn is one of the conspiracy theorists.
I believe that there are Israeli elements that are connected to the Mossad that are involved in this attack.
There's no physical evidence to support claims that Jews were behind 9/11. But
How about that? No physical evidence. Is it funny that they just say this is what they believe, they don't say any of our arguments and just claim there's no evidence?
Mm-hmm. Well, she says no physical evidence. There is abundant evidence that the Israeli military intelligence was involved in the creation of the war on terror. You see, when you understand that the war on terror construct is a construct of Israeli military intelligence, then the Israeli involvement in 9/11 makes a lot more sense. Because what you find in my 9/11 research in the Solving 9/11 books shows that at every critical point there's an Israeli agent involved, or an American Zionist who's working with them.
Undisputable. Everywhere you look, you document it in your books. Like in a second, I'm going to have you bullet point go through all the evidence of Israeli involvement. Okay. We'll see how many you can get, and I'll time you for like 2 minutes. Can you get 50? You think?
I don't know.
I bet you can.
Speculation and rumors, mostly discounted here in the U.S., have gained momentum in Muslim countries, where they're discussed and believed. Deborah Lauder is with the Jewish-run Anti-Defamation League.
What's most troubling is when it reaches the internet and goes into the Muslim Arab world, we have this cross-fertilization of hate, and this is something we've never seen before.
A whole web of...
Doesn't it seem like the ADL is trying to associate 9/11 truthers with the terrorists, like we're terrorist sympathizers?
Yeah.
We're terrorists too, essentially, is what they're trying to say.
Yeah, well,
right?
She's saying that 9/11 truth that looks at Israeli involvement in 9/11 is hateful.
Mm-hmm.
And, the thing is that, first of all, we're not talking about Jews as a group or Israelis as a nationality. We're talking about a very small subset. Obviously, this was a cell that was created back in the 1970s that took the 9/11 operation further through time. And it was a very compartmentalized group of people, and we know who some of these people are. But they are all primarily at the highest level Zionists that are part of the Likud party, military intelligence people, and people that belong to this Israeli criminal network.
You hear this stuff, and it just makes you sick to your stomach. There is absolutely no evidence that anybody other than Al-Qaeda was involved with this attack.
Okay, right there. Absolutely no evidence.
Right.
So your challenge now.
Right.
Israeli involvement in 9/11. Give me, let's just do the top 10. You don't have to get into all the details. People can watch your presentations and read your books, which they absolutely should. They should know, everybody should know this information. But let's go. 10 bullet points of undisputed evidence.
Let's go chronologically then.
Yeah.
In 1978, the senior Israeli intelligence agent in Hollywood, Arnon Milchan, made a film, his first film, he made it in Europe, in which a Boeing 747 crashes into a high-rise building like the Pan Am building in New York. So that's like ideation, putting the idea out there.
Was that movie, did they already have the idea to put the plane in the tower and then it was predictive programming and they put it out? Or did they get the idea from 9/11 from the movie?
No, that's a good question, because what you see is in the late 1970s, Menachem Begin from the Likud, created the Likud party in 73, came to power in 77. And that's when the ball started rolling. The dual ball of the war on terror and 9/11. So that in 1978, for example, 1 year after Menachem Begin becomes prime minister, Arnon Milchan makes his film, The Medusa Touch, in which a large Boeing crashes into a big building. The same year, 1 year later, the former head of the Mossad, Yisrael Harel, the founding father of the Mossad, predicts to an American Zionist that Arabs will attack the tallest buildings in New York City. And 22 years later, it happens.
Okay, so there's two.
Yeah.
Medusa Touch, prediction to the Zionists.
Yeah.
Okay,
then in 1979, the Netanyahu Institute in Jerusalem hosts a conference called the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism, in which they roll out this new doctrine that the United States and the Western democracies have to come and fight Islamic terrorism in the Middle East, basically to protect Israel. It's not put that way. It's described a little bit differently, that they say that terrorists attack Israel because it's a Western state, therefore the West has an obligation to come and protect.
No. I remember hearing that on 9/11, is that an attack on them is really an attack on us. They're just closer.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so that was 3 then. The conference where they rolled out the propaganda for the war on terror. Yeah,
and then Yisrael Harel, a couple years later, 2 of his senior lieutenants, Zvi Malkin and Shalom Ben-Dor, Avram Shalom Ben-Dor. These names are a little bit dodgy, but these 2 men are senior lieutenants under Yisrael Harel in the Mossad. They were involved in the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann, for example, from Argentina. They were involved in the smuggling of plutonium from Pennsylvania to Israel. So these are very high-level Mossad agents, and they come to the United States like in their 50s or in their 60s, I guess, in early 1980s. And they try to get the security contract for the World Trade Center. They get a contract in 1987 for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for the World Trade Center in some sort of anti-terrorism protection for the World Trade Center. And when it's discovered that Avram Shalom Ben-Dor is using a fake name and that he's been convicted of murder as the head of Shin Bet in Israel, the contract is torn up. So you see, it went from being a fantasy or a prediction of Yisrael Harel to 2 of his main men coming to the United States and getting the contract for the World Trade Center. So
9/11 would have happened back in the late 80s if they wouldn't have got their contract canceled.
Yes, if that contract had gone through, then they would have been prepared for the operation in the late 80s.
So that's 4 things, 3 or 4 things. She said there's no evidence, but those are all undisputed, very hard, compelling evidence. What would you say is some more top connections?
Then you have the role of Michael Chertoff. In 1993, there was the first bombing of the World Trade Center, where a car bomb went off, in which the FBI was very much involved in the operation that was like a sting operation. The FBI paid this Egyptian Colonel Salem $1 million to testify against the, motley crew he had collected around him, including the blind sheikh. These people went to jail for like 5,000 years. Michael Chertoff was a key person in the prosecution from New Jersey. And because the case was had its roots, the conspiracy apparently had its roots in New Jersey, according to the operation. Michael Chertoff then, fast forward a few years, is then the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, responsible for, he was given the portfolio for investigating the 9/11 crime. Mm-hmm. But rather than investigate it, he allowed the evidence to be destroyed. Now, Michael Chertoff, you have to understand, is a son of the Mossad. He's an Israeli American. His mother was an Israeli citizen, which makes him an Israeli citizen. His mother was one of the first Mossad agents in Israel.
Yeah.
And
you write about that in your book.
Yeah.
She worked for the airlines that brought all the people to
right
Israel.
from Yemen. Operation Magic Carpet, I think it was called. So.
And isn't his dad a Talmudic scholar?
Was yes,
was?
yes,
Okay.
that's right, Rabbi Chertoff. And so Michael Chertoff plays a key role in the prosecution that didn't happen, the investigation that was a non-investigation. That's really important to understand, because if 9/11 had been investigated by any competent law enforcement in this country, the game would have been up. So they had to make sure that there was no proper investigation. So what did they do? Instead of calling it a crime, they called it an act of war, already on September 11th. By calling it an act of war, it meant that the military would be the instrument used to deliver justice, so that there would be no investigation. So then Michael Chertoff basically facilitated the cover-up by confiscating evidence in the form of videotapes and steel and engine parts, what have you.
Detainees, Israeli spy detainees.
All that. And then facilitating the cover-up. So, and he's a key person. Mm-hmm. The operation could not have gone ahead had they not made sure that they had absolute 100% security in the form of control of U.S. law enforcement.
Mm-hmm. And Michael Chertoff's cousin was at Popular Mechanics working on the debunking 9/11.
Right.
And you were the one that called his mom and found if they were related, and she said yes.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because you go to the debunking articles and they say, well, Michael Chertoff wasn't even at the Homeland Security until several years after that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he wasn't the head of Homeland Security, but what position was he on 9/11? Number 2 at the FBI?
Michael Chertoff?
Yeah.
He was Assistant Attorney General, and he was in charge of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice, and he was the one that was given, John Ashcroft, who was Attorney General, gave the portfolio to Chertoff. Chertoff had the final say in all decisions regarding 9/11 investigation. Then later, he became the head of Homeland Security, the second one, I think, and in that position, he maintained his control over the evidence of 9/11. That's very important, because the 9/11 crime, you have to look at the cover-up and the destruction of evidence. And there again, you find that the network that destroyed the evidence and the junkyards that were responsible for the destruction of evidence were under the control of Israeli Zionists.
Okay, so Michael Chertoff, all his connections, the junkyard.
The junkyards.
Also, the P-Tech. Who was P-Tech?
P-Tech was the little enterprise software company in Quincy, Massachusetts, who had their software running on all of the federal computers on 9/11, military computers. And they had spent 2 years in the basement of the FAA with MITRE Corporation, checking to see the interoperability between the FAA and military in the event of a catastrophe just like this one. Mm-hmm. And the computer network and the computer system failed on 9/11, obviously. So.
And the security company at Homeland Security at the Twin Towers, at the World Trade Center, and at the airports.
Yeah. Okay. There's 2 different security companies. At the airports, it was Huntley USA, which is an Israeli-owned company owned by ICTS in Holland, and that's a Mossad LL security company from the beginning. And they controlled airport security and passenger screening operations at the airports involved in 9/11. Then at the World Trade Center, the company that was responsible for security procedures was a company called Kroll Associates, which is, again, owned by Jules Kroll and involved Maurice Greenberg. These are again high-level Zionists, and the Israeli guys that tried to get the security contract for the World Trade Center, Avram Shalom Ben-Dor, had gone to work for Kroll Associates after 1993.
So they still got it, even though they had it canceled in '87.
They got it through using an American Trojan horse.
Mm-hmm. And they finally got it and then pulled it off shortly after.
It looks that way. Philip Zelikow is a very Zionist guy. He had a lot of power in creating George Bush in the beginning with creating George Bush as president. But when they wanted to do a year later, more than a year later, when they wanted to set up this 9/11 commission to basically write the myth, they first went to Kissinger, but Kissinger didn't want to reveal his client list, so then the second choice was Philip Zelikow. And so Philip Zelikow became the executive director of the 9/11 Commission report. And he came to the table with a fully detailed outline of what the commission report would say in the end, before the commission even began meeting. And Mr. Philip Zelikow, he's a Jewish fellow from Texas or from Southern California, both places he's lived and studied. When he got his degree, his PhD was on the creation and maintenance of the public myth. And that's what he created with the 9/11 Commission report. So it's like when I concluded my Solving 9/11 book finally in 2011, I wanted to investigate how the deception was contained by the destruction of evidence and the cover-up. And that's really important. Like Nixon said, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. Because in the cover-up, you see all of the key players, they have to reveal themselves. It's the same thing with the media in this country. You know, the media has been complicit in the 9/11 cover-up. They can never come back. They can never redeem themselves to the American people. They have been part of the betrayal.
That's how I know 9/11 is a conspiracy, because you do the research, like we're talking about, Zionist fingerprints all over it, everywhere you look, from top to bottom, going back 30 years. And then you hear the media and CNN say there's absolutely no evidence. They're obviously lying and not even being objective, even 1% objective.
Right.
So you're right, the cover-up is the biggest evidence of 9/11, even more in your face than the buildings blowing up and coming down in free fall, I believe.
Because you see, it'll take some real investigation to find out who put the nanothermite in the World Trade Center, where the nanothermite was made, etc. You know, finding the fingerprints of the actual criminals involved in the crime, that's harder to do. But the people who are involved in the cover-up and the deception and taking the country to war based on the lie, that's all very clear. So what we really need is a huge investigation in this country in which all of the people who are involved in the 9/11 crime and cover-up are arrested and charged and investigated thoroughly, like Chertoff, to find out who was calling the shots and connecting the network. And that will require something no less than a political revolution in this country, because it would stand the entire power structure on its head. That's why I'm saying that, you know, we don't have a lot of hope that it's like we live in an occupied government right now. We live in a government that's occupied, our nation's occupied, and trying to work within this occupied government for 9/11 truth when the whole deck is stacked against you is very difficult. That's why it's going to take a real revolution of awareness, popular revolution.
They Google 9/11 conspiracies. One of the first things that's going to come up is Snopes, and it's going to be an article saying that it's debunked that conspiracy theorists believe that 4,000 Israelis didn't show up to work that day. I'm sure you've heard about this. Where did that originate? Do you know?
Yeah, the story about the 4,000 Israelis who were thought to be at the World Trade Center or the Pentagon on 9/11 came from the Israeli Foreign Ministry itself, and it was reported by Jerusalem Post online. And the editor of the newspaper said later that this has been, they were completely accurate in the reporting. So 4,000 families in Israel contacted the foreign ministry asking about their loved ones, and that's the source of that. It's nothing Arabic about it. It comes straight from the Israeli government itself. And combine that with the Odigo instant messaging service that had a warning that went out several hours before 9/11 that warned of an attack at the World Trade Center and was precise to the minute. Those two facts together indicate that that warning went out, was received, and many people escaped injury that day.
So there is some truth to the 4,000 claim, or was that purposely put out to be disinfo
No,
a red herring.
No, it's completely true that that about the 4,000. I mean, as reported in the Jerusalem Post, it came from the source is the Israeli Foreign Ministry itself.
Okay. And it came from family members in Israel calling and finding out that they didn't go that day. Like they were all like Silverstein.
Well,
they
were wondering. They were calling the foreign ministry to find out what was the status, if they had information about that person, one of those 4,000 people, and the instant messaging seems to have worked in that many Israelis seem to have gotten the message to stay away from the World Trade Center that day.
Only 2 people came forward as reported.
Well, two people in Israel got the message. The vice president of the company said the warning was precise to the minute. This was only reported in a few Haaretz newspaper and maybe in the New York Times once, or the Washington Post once, and never reported again. It was the whole story about the prior warning from Odigo, and the indication, the evidence that Israelis were warned ahead of time, was never discussed again.
But there's no evidence.
No evidence.
Yeah.
How upsetting is this to you?
Look, we've been kicked around for 2,000 years. The face you're looking at's got a lot of anger in it because of that. That's not a way to live, wandering around the globe, never having a home. It's pretty difficult because every time there's trouble, we're scapegoated. We're not the only ones that are scapegoated, but we're scapegoated by people who are frightened. They don't care. They are paranoid. You cannot debunk this theory. It is madness as well as idiocy to think that the Jews brought down the World Trade Center on 9/11. But you cannot argue logic to someone who is mentally ill. What frightens me is that the whole nation is frightened, and that fear is being fueled by this administration and by the media.
Who is this guy?
Michael Gross, constitutional lawyer, it says.
I've never seen him at any other time besides this.
No, I haven't either.
But it's weird that he comes on and just... First of all, they're on a panel with CNN. Everybody is against the conspiracy. Why don't they have you in studio to actually have a rebuttal to his arguments?
Right. Well, if you look at the CNN piece, you see how they tried to set me up. They asked me if I was anti-Semitic. I said, no, this is what they say when you criticize Israeli policy. Then they cut and go to that woman from the ADL who says... That's what they all say.
When you imply that somehow Israelis were involved in the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, people are going to look at you, critics will say, you are an anti-Semite. Are you?
No, I'm not an anti-Semite. This is the main charge that's leveled against me, and has been for years, even before 9/11, because I am a critic of Zionist policies.
That's a very common technique among anti-Semites. They will twist things. I'm not an anti-Semite. I just believe X, Y, Z.
So it's with video editing that's been done by CNN. This is a hit piece, and this piece aired on TV the night before I was supposed to go on trial.
Elaborating on the whole anti-Semitic thing, it's like literally any criticism of Israel to them or criticism of people behind 9/11 is anti-Semitic. So according to them, they can't do anything wrong, and there's no legitimate criticisms. That's literally
that's not quite what they're saying. What they're saying though is that you cannot criticize Israel. You cannot criticize Israeli crimes. You cannot criticize Jewish crimes, or you cannot identify them as being Israeli or Jewish crimes. They're protected. That's what they're saying. They're not saying that the Jews or Israel doesn't commit crimes. In my Solving 9/11 book, I have a quote from the former chief of staff of the Israeli military, who says that if the truth ever comes out, he says you will see that Israel has been involved in crimes 1,000 times worse than anything going on in Colombia. He was talking about the Colombia drug trade. So it's not like Israel doesn't commit crimes. It's that they want to make it so that it's a crime to report them. It's a crime to identify them as Israeli crimes. I don't write anything about Jewish crimes. I'm writing about a crime that was committed by very evil people who may happen to be Israeli nationals, like Netanyahu or Michael Chertoff. But that's as far as it goes. When you investigate a crime, the reason why I call the book Solving 9/11 is because 9/11, I could see from the very beginning, was not going to be solved. There was no interest in solving 9/11 at all. They gave us a prepared false narrative to go to war.
And that's what we're supposed to live with. So when I approached this as an investigative journalist, I looked at it as we're trying to solve this thing. We're trying to solve it as a crime. And when you're solving a crime, you go where the evidence takes you.
Do you ever think that you might be wrong?
In the beginning, when I first started, I approached it very cautiously. Mm-hmm. So for the first couple years, I was very, very cautious about what I said and how I said it. But as my investigation went on, year after year, and I found that at every single point in the matrix, and every single point where a decision had to be made to protect the 9/11 story, to advance the war agenda, and to cover up the truth, I found either an Israeli national, tied to the Israeli government, or an American who was working as a Zionist agent. People like Larry Silverstein, for example, who was the former national chairman of the United Jewish Appeal. Michael Chertoff.
Co-workers with Ehud Barak.
Yeah, or
and weekly phone calls.
Weekly phone calls. Yes, Silverstein had weekly phone calls with Netanyahu. So then the consistency was 100%. So the question was, okay, so are these Israelis all involved in the crime, covering up the crime, promoting the deception to protect some third party like the Saudis or the German death cult or the Jesuits? Unlikely. So that consistency is compelling, that the nature of the crime we're dealing with here in 9/11 and the war on terror is that it's an Israeli/Zionist operation. Now, Zionist, of course, means much more than the State of Israel. When you talk about the Zionist establishment, you're talking about the Rothschilds as well. You're talking about the Zionist International that is located around the world.
You mentioned the Jesuits. I hear a lot that the Jesuits control the Zionists, or the Zionists created the Jesuits to take out the Catholic Church. Where do the Jesuits fit into the whole Zionist 9/11 scenario, if at all?
I don't know. I don't see any hallmarks of a Jesuit operation here. It's an Israeli thing, but there are other players. Like Mr. Mueller from the FBI. He came on the scene 7 days before, but he was the junior man on the totem pole. Above him, he had Michael Chertoff telling him what to do, or Rudy Giuliani, or Governor Pataki. But in every case, you find that these people were not the masterminds, but there was another person who had very clear ties to Israel, who was the person making the decisions.
How about the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers? I've got a friend who's a big-time 9/11 guy. Mm-hmm. He thinks that Rockefellers planned 9/11 when they built the towers in the 50s, I believe it was. What part do you believe the Rockefellers played?
Well, I don't think that they planned to destroy the towers as they did, because the towers were destroyed using a form of nanothermite that was only invented in the 1990s. Whether they had this idea down the road that they would destroy these towers, I don't know.
What do you think about all the predictive programming? Are they coincidences, or is it the Israeli-controlled media putting it out there in the public consciousness, like they did with the Medusa touch? If the Medusa touch is predictive programming, then you have to think lone gunmen and all these other things that we've seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know why they do that. But like you said, the lone gunman episode that was done by, again, Arnon Milchan's business partner Rupert Murdoch made that film. It aired on Fox TV 6 months before 9/11. It depicted a passenger aircraft being remotely hijacked and flown into the World Trade Center. This is pretty uncanny prediction. So it's like, why they did that? Why do they do things like that? I don't know. Some people say that it's because they want to lower their karmic debt. I don't know how that lowers your karmic debt, but...
Or like black magic or something, kind of law that they have to tell us. You write in your book, you speculate that the filming of the lone gunman may have been part of the final planning for 9/11? Yeah,
well, I mean in the sense that they used helicopters and they flew at night across Manhattan, across in the flight path, when they filmed the plane coming into the World Trade Center, that footage they needed, they did it at night. They flew a helicopter, and that, they're flying the path that the planes took that hit the World Trade Center. So why was that done? I don't know. But it's what they're doing is that they were visualizing, they were manifesting, filming an attack very similar to what happened 6 months later or a year later. So you can see that there's certainly the potential for getting some information that they would need for the actual attack.
So we know that mainstream media is Zionist controlled or Zionist sympathizers. They're not going to cover 9/11. How about the alternative media and controlled opposition in the alternative media, in particular Alex Jones? Tell me about Alex Jones.
Well, I don't know Alex Jones that well. I don't watch him, but I've been on his show years ago, and I've been in touch with him by phone. I think the last time was about 2006 or 2005. And I guess he doesn't go to 9/11 Truth regarding the Israelis, but I've seen some things, some of the videos you've brought out where he talks about being visited by the Mossad, and he says something like, Israel wasn't the only country behind 9/11. Well, that's interesting that he says that. But
he's spreading the blame and pointing fingers elsewhere. All he talks about is 28 pages.
But he admits in that video where he talks about the Mossad visiting that Israel had a role. He does say that. But the alternative media can be just as controlled as the mainstream media because media requires money. Alex Jones has quite an operation. I don't know how how his operation is funded, but I can tell you that 9/11 Truth, like I do, it's not a lucrative thing at all. You pay a big price for it, and when the mainstream media requires funding to produce their product, the people who fund the operation will call the tune.
A few years ago, you were on your book tour and you stopped in Austin, Texas, and you reached out to, I think you said 4 people that worked for InfoWars. So for sure they got the message. You were there. You're the leading 9/11 researcher. You've broken the whole story, travel around the world. You're essentially like the leader of the 9/11 Truth movement. I don't want to put that on you, but you essentially are. You've got the best books. You pointed out who did it. You're traveling the country. And Alex Jones made his name on 9/11, but he won't even have you on as a guest anymore. Even when people call in and say, you got to read this book, you got to. How serious can he be about 9/11 if he ignores you?
Well, yeah, that's a very good point. It seems that he's been created to be this voice of the opposition, but only goes so far. That he doesn't want to, he doesn't want to give me any airtime to discuss 9/11 Truth as it is.
Have you thought about calling in the show?
Well, I've been to Austin twice. No, I've never thought about calling in. I've been to Austin twice. He's been invited both times, and he has never, responded.
He's completely abandoned 9/11 Truth. He doesn't talk about it anymore at all. What do you think about like the Bible and talking about the synagogue of Satan?
Oh, well, that's from the Book of Revelation. Yeah, they talk about these imposters in the Jewish faith who are not Jews but are a synagogue of Satan. And Christ said the same thing when he talked about the Pharisees and the scribes and said that they were the spawn of Satan. That's very, very harsh words, but there's a lot of truth in that because when you understand that the Talmud, the rabbinical interpretation of the Torah, stands the Torah on its head and negates the teachings of the Mosaic law, that you're dealing with the corruption of the religion, the corruption of the Scripture, as we see with the Schofield Bible for Christians. It's like when people change the Scripture to suit their agenda, it can be very evil. And when they say that in the end times, I hope we're not in the end times, but that there are times of great deception and there will be false prophets, etc. This is we see this around us all the time. This is reality today. We live in a very strange and uncomfortable reality where this is a spiritual war. This is but any war between truth and falsehood, And light and dark is a spiritual battle. And when your country and your fellow citizens are so deceived, when your nation is deceived, that is a very evil thing. And when you consider the evilness of 9/11, then the evilness of the deception is just as bad as the crime of mass murder. So it's a spiritual battle.
Speaking of spiritual battle, you wrote a letter to the Pope about 9/11 truth. Mm-hmm. And did they respond to that at all?
No. I wrote an open letter to the Pope, and I sent him the hard copy of the letter. And I thought that the head of the Catholic Church should speak out about the deception that we've been under about 9/11, because this deception has been used to take the nation and the world to war against another religion, against another faith, against Islam. And so this is a very, very big thing. And it requires leadership from our religious leaders to quell the fire, to explain to people, to the faithful, that we've been deceived and that these wars are not justified. That's not a hard thing to do. But apparently, there's no interest in the religious community, in the academic community, or in our political establishment to do any of that. That gives you an idea of how deeply entrenched this deception is.
It's so easy for you and me and so many people we know to see the deception and to be passionate and speak out about it. What do you think is hindering so many other people from blocking them from doing it?
Well, it's a hard thing to do. Just intellectually grappling with 9/11 truth and embracing it means that you have to come to the conclusion that your government has been lying to you for 16 years in the greatest democracy in the world, and that our media is hardly free, but our media is complicit in the 9/11 cover-up. These are very hard pills to swallow for an American. We grow up thinking that we live in a free country and that we have a free media and that the truth prevails, and to see that none of that is true, and that we're living in a very strange place where the government, the media, the institutions that we believe in can no longer be trusted. That shows that we're on the verge of something new, we're on the cusp of a new beginning, but it also means that it's very hard for the average person to cope with, to accept.
Well, I hear the debunkers all the time say that it's more comforting for 9/11 conspiracy theorists to think that there's a conspiracy behind everything, and that that worldview is more comforting to us. What do you say to that? Are you more comforted to know that 9/11 was an inside job, or would it be better if you believed the official story?
Well, the official story is a conspiracy theory as well. So let's put that to rest. It's like what the government has said is never been proven regarding Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm an investigative journalist who has found, leads and conclusions as who's behind the 9/11 crime. It's not a theory. It's an investigation. And it's my attempt to solve the crime that changed our country. But there's nothing comfortable about, there can be no comfort at all in believing a false narrative, which we've been given. I think that it's much more comforting to know the truth, to understand who is really behind 9/11, to understand who's behind the war on terror, because then you'll realize that things aren't nearly as bad as they make them out to be. We are not on the verge of a religious war with Islam. Islam is not trying to break down the doors and to destroy us as a civilization or a nation. This is all fear that's been imposed on us. And so to be in deception, to be in fear, to be deceived is a much worse place to be than to have some truth. The truth is, like it says in the Bible, the truth will set you free. But to be deceived and to accept the deception, knowing that it's a deception, is a very unenviable place to be.
I got 3 more questions. 2 of them are, I'm just going to kind of lead you into 2 of the things. These are 2 of the things from your book that were new to me that I thought were very powerful pieces of information. Number 1 is Shimon Peres and Moshe Shalat. There's a quote in there about that Peres wants to frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims. That is so just incriminating, and to follow your whole thesis of what happened in the 70s and in the 80s.
Right.
Can you?
Yeah, that was a quote by the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, Moshe Sharett, and the Shimon Peres had been one of the masterminds of a terrorist operation in Egypt against American and British targets, libraries, cultural institutions, in which they had put nitroglycerin bombs into these places, in order to be blamed on the Muslim Brotherhood and to drive a wedge between the United States and Britain and the Egyptian government at the time. Shimon Peres was one of the masterminds, along with Pinhas Lavon and Moshe Dayan. And when the Prime Minister discovered this, he wrote in his journal what he said about Shimon Peres being wanting to frighten the West, just like Pinhas Lavon. So this is in the early 1950s. So Israel was carrying out false flag terror operations in Egypt in the early 1950s in order to drive a wedge between the United States and the leading Arab country, Egypt. They haven't changed, and Shimon Peres was the president and a high-ranking Israeli politician when 9/11 happened. I think when 9/11 happened, I think he was actually foreign minister. But in any case, that is his modus operandi. That's how he has always functioned. That's been the Israeli method ever since the creation of the State of Israel, to scare the West into supporting Israel's aims. And that's where we are today. That's where all this terrorism, fear of Islam comes at us from the media and the Zionists, because they want us to be afraid and paralyzed so that we will be willing to wage war against the Islamic world and the Arab states that they target.
Yeah, watch any clip of Netanyahu at the United Nations or addressing Congress, and that's all he talks about is the fear of Iran, the fear of Al-Qaeda, the fear of Iraq, and how we need to act because they're all building bombs to kill us.
Right. Because the whole war on terror construct only works if the public is afraid. And it's like, that's the point of my work, is to undeceive people and to show them that this terrible monster that's in the darkness isn't really there at all. It's all an artificial construct. And when people realize that it's like a Wizard of Oz play, it's like somebody trying to scare you by waving something scary in front of your face, it's not real. The reality is much less scary than the deception. And that's why my book, Solving 9/11, I have the light coming over, because in the darkness, when people are in the darkness, their fears manifest in their and scare them out of their wits. But when you're dealing with reality, it's something that's much easier for a person to cope with.
Can you name me like the top 3 people you think were involved with planning 9/11?
Well, the people at the top who planned 9/11, these would be people in Israeli military intelligence whose names would not mean much to anybody. But at a political level, I would say that it would be Shimon Peres. I would think Benjamin Netanyahu, because he's been the promoter of the war on terror agenda since 1979. I would think Shaul Eisenberg, Mr. Big in China for the Israeli Mossad. I think Ehud Barak, not a Likudnik, but I think Ehud Barak played a key role. And I would say also Ariel Sharon. And then going back one generation, men who were still alive when 9/11 happened or just recently deceased, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. These would be the political players that, except for Shaul Eisenberg, he's not very well known, but the rest of them are people who Americans understand who these people were. These people were terrorists, absolute terrorists. They always used terrorism. Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, they murdered the UN envoy to Palestine, Volker Bernadotte, in 1948. They bombed the King David Hotel in 1946. They massacred Palestinians in Deir Yassin and other villages. These are bona fide, real terrorist leaders. In fact, Menachem Begin took the mantle of being the father of terrorism in the whole world. So when terrorism then happens, when their agenda goes through and their people commit terrorism, what's the problem? Yeah, why is it anti-Semitic? You know, I lived in Israel when Menachem Begin came to power, and it was a very sad day for, you know, people from the Labor Party because they realized that the terrorists had taken power.
There's a quote in your book about, I think it's Ben Gurion. They say he's the king of terrorism, and he goes, the king of terrorism in the world. He corrected him. Like, they brag about their terrorism. It's no secret, right, of the history of terrorism of the Mossad and the Irgun.
That was Menachem Begin who said that when he was asked, you know, and he said, what is it like to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And he said, in the Middle East, he said, in all the world. So you know, that's the reason why Zionist history is not taught in American schools, because if American universities taught the history of Zionism, you would understand the evilness and the terrorist nature of the Zionist project, because the state of Israel was born in terrorism and has survived with terrorism ever since. Okay.
It talks in your book, the last chapter, a Muslim guy was writing it, right? Who wrote the last chapter?
It was the Nation of Islam Research Group.
They talk about the significance of your work in history. And I'd like to ask you, how often do you think about your place in history, and what will people write about you hundreds of years from now if the truth is known about 9/11?
Well, I don't know. I don't think about that often. You know, it's been 16 years I've been working on this, and it's been a very big effort. You know, it took a lot of time and a lot of energy, and it's had a lot of costs for me and my family. So I just hope that people will waken up and realize what's happened to this country, and and if my work contributes to that awakening, if my work contributes to shortening the war on terror by one day, if my work contributes to the prosecution and indictment of the people who carried out 9/11, that will be the best reward.
Pulitzer for 100 years. So there's very bad guys who you're exposing here. You've literally you've uncovered the motive, the people behind it. Do you fear for your life when you go out in public and people are protesting? That very well could be somebody violent that wants to shut you up for exposing them for these crimes.
Yeah, well, I'm cautious and everything like that. You know, I try to be as careful as possible. But you know, to think that that the criminal network behind 9/11 is all powerful and able to you know, reach anywhere. Yeah, you know, they are a criminal network, but they're men like you and I, and you know, their life goes on. Many of them have died. Many of them have moved on to other things. They have accomplished. They have gotten what they wanted. They got the war on terror. They got all the war on terror in spades. They've got terrorism going on in Europe and America. They've got the wars going on in a half a dozen countries. They've destroyed Syria. They've destroyed Iraq. They've destroyed Afghanistan. They've destroyed, you know, Libya. They got what they wanted. So for me to be, you know, explaining, you know, my side of this and explaining what the war on terrorism is all about, I guess they have no problem with that. It's like they've achieved their goal. They've achieved billions and billions of dollars. They've disrupted the Middle East. They're redrawing the map of the Middle East. You know, nothing has stopped them, and they're destroying this country. That's really important. And you know, anybody who has any patriotic feeling for the United States of America should engage in 9/11 truth and demand an end to the war on terror and demand accountability from you know, the people in the media and the government who have covered up this crime for 16 years. It's just outrageous.
It is outrageous, I agree. Every 9/11 truther needs to read these books. If you haven't, you're completely uninformed. These are the best books about 9/11. I've read both of them several times. Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World, and The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East. The War on Terror and 9/11 go hand in hand. They're essentially the same crime.
Yeah.
Chris has sacrificed a lot for this information. He's a man of courage and integrity. I appreciate you so much for sitting down and taking the time with me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And everybody needs to read these books and share the information with everybody you know. Any last words, Chris?
Well, thank you very much, and I couldn't agree more on the need to understand that we've been deceived about 9/11, and we've been deceived for a reason. And the reason is to take us into this long, open-ended criminal war in the Middle East and elsewhere. And in order to end the deception, we need to increase awareness. And the more people who become aware of 9/11 and the lies of 9/11 will understand the lies of the war on terror. We've been deceived into war. The war agenda will destroy this nation. It will impoverish this nation, it will destroy this nation, and it's incumbent, it's imperative that any patriotic American do their utmost to expose the deception and end the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you.